I went to the company where my husband is the CEO for a meeting. His secretary introduced herself as the CEO's wife and announced my firing in front of everyone. I did not say a word, but my husband was paralyzed with fear. I still remember that morning very clearly. There are events in life that, before you step into them, you think are just ordinary meetings, but by the time you walk out, your entire life has changed its course. That morning, the Los Angeles sun was intensely hot. It was barely past 9, but the asphalt in front of the Apex Holdings skyscraper was radiating waves of heat that made the road ahead look like it was vibrating. I stepped out of my car, holding a black leather briefcase, and looked up at the glass building rising nearly 40 stories before me. 3 years ago, I stood in this exact spot. The only difference was that back then, a man was holding my hand tightly and telling me to trust him, promising he would give me the best life possible. That man was my husband, Hunter. 3 years. 3 years is not a lifetime, but it is enough to turn someone with empty hands into a man standing at the peak of success, and it is also enough to turn a promise into a joke. I walked into the grand lobby. The receptionist took one look at me and immediately stood up. She started to greet me but stopped midway, her eyes filled with confusion. I knew what she was going to call me. For 3 years, I had never appeared at the company under a public title. Everyone only heard rumors that the corporation had a mysterious female majority shareholder, but very few had ever seen her face. I smiled softly and told her it was fine and to carry on with her work. She nodded repeatedly. As I walked past the front desk, I heard whispering behind me. Someone asked if that was her, and another voice quietly faded away. I did not turn around. When I reached the 36th floor and the elevator doors opened, I immediately felt something was off. The floor was more crowded than usual. People were rushing back and forth, and a few employees were even carrying flower bouquets. I frowned. Right at that moment, a young woman in a red dress carrying a stack of documents walked past and intentionally bumped her shoulder against mine. She demanded to know to watch where I was going. She looked up and scanned me from head to toe, her eyes filled with an obnoxious sense of judgment. I looked back at her. She was quite pretty, with a delicate face, pale skin, heavy makeup, and a tight red dress with a plunging neckline. The handbag on her arm was a newly released designer piece. The diamond earrings she was wearing cost around $10,000. The remarkable thing was that I remembered that exact expense very clearly because the invoice was still in the financial files I audited last week. At the time, I thought Hunter had bought a gift for a client. Seeing the jewelry on this woman's ears, I finally understood. She stared at me for a few more seconds and asked what department I was in. I calmly replied that I was going up for a meeting. She let out a laugh. A meeting. Her eyes looked as if she had just heard the funniest joke in the world. She told me that today was the board of directors meeting and ordinary people were not allowed in. I looked at her and asked if that was so. She flipped her hair and noted that I looked unfamiliar, bragging that she knew almost everyone in the company but had never seen me before. Before I could say anything, someone called out for Mia from behind. The girl turned around as a few administrative assistants ran up to tell her the boardroom was ready. She smiled brightly, turned back to me, and said she was very busy. She took 2 steps, then turned back to look at me, casually adding that she was the special assistant to the CEO. She smiled smugly. I stood still for a few seconds. Special assistant. I knew for a fact the company did not have that position. When I reviewed the corporate structure just 2 months ago, it did not exist. I walked toward the boardroom. As the doors opened, all 20 people in the room turned to look. The room fell silent for a few seconds. Some people turned pale, some recognized me, but most did not. Before I could even sit down, that girl's voice rang out from behind. She demanded to know who let me in here. I turned around. Mia walked up, her face no longer holding any fake politeness. She crossed her arms and looked at me like a subordinate, asking if I understood English. She stated this was a high-level executive meeting. I pulled out a chair and sat down, simply saying I knew. She scoffed, asking why I came in if I knew. She yelled for security. Nobody moved. The atmosphere began to freeze. I looked around. The older executives were avoiding my gaze, clearly trying to suppress something. Mia frowned, asking if I was deaf, then marched right up to my face. She slammed her folder onto the table and announced clearly that she was the fiancé of CEO Hunter and the future boss of this company. Then she pointed at me and told me I was fired. The entire room went dead silent. Someone nearly dropped a glass of water. As for me, I just looked at her and smiled lightly. Because right at that moment, the boardroom doors opened again. Hunter walked in. The very second he saw me sitting there, his face drained of all color. I had not said a single word, but I could clearly see the man who once promised to protect me for a lifetime trembling at the knees. The next day, when I stepped into my office at the Apex Holdings building, The atmosphere still lingered with the aftermath of yesterday's meeting. The entire floor had gone quiet upon my arrival. Hunter, the man I used to call my husband, stood before me, stunned and looking completely lost, unable to utter a word. I stood at the door, holding my briefcase, scanning the room. All the employees avoided my eyes. Some looked resentful, others curious. I knew they were all wondering what exactly had happened. My task today was not just to continue running the business, but to purge all the lingering issues, the secrets Hunter thought he could hide forever. I sat at my desk, took a deep breath, and skimmed through the documents my assistant had prepared last night, sorting them by priority. I started with the murky expenses, the shady investment projects, and the list of people Hunter had secretly been funding with company money. Money he thought I did not know about. I memorized every single number over the last 3 years. A total of $10 million had been funneled out of the company into 4 private accounts. Among them were mistresses I could not even name, and an offshore account. I noticed my hands shaking slightly, but my mind was perfectly calm. I understood that true power was now in my hands. Hunter stepped into my office, his face still as pale as yesterday. This time, he tried to force a smile, which I knew was entirely useless. I said nothing, just looked at him with a gaze sharp as a knife cutting right through his fake demeanor, silencing him completely. He looked awkward, his eyes stripped of the confidence of a CEO, leaving nothing but panic and fear. I held up my share certificate, clearly stating I owned 51% of the company with absolute decision-making power, and looked at him. I asked him if he thought he still had any power here. I could hear his heavy breathing. He exhaled sharply, stepping forward to explain, but the words choked in his throat. I no longer wanted to hear any of his excuses. 3 years ago, I put all my trust in him, believing he was a man who truly loved me. But 3 years was enough for me to realize that his love was just a transaction of money, power, and status. As for me, I was still myself. A self-made woman who worked hard and relied on no one, even when standing before the man who called me his wife. I called my assistant and ordered the preparation of transfer documents and detailed bank statements for the past 3 years. Everyone around was dead silent. No one dared to speak. They just watched me work, and I realized that power is not about giving orders, but about people looking at you and knowing they cannot fight back. Hunter stood there, his eyes wide, his forehead wrinkled, realizing that everything he had done, all the hidden funds, all the secrets he thought were safe, were now arranged logically in my hands as hard evidence. I began auditing every account, every transaction. When I read the amounts he had been sending to his former mistresses, I did not feel angry. I only felt the clear weight of justice and personal power, the kind of strength a woman can possess without relying on any man. I called Hunter closer and handed him the statements and receipts one by one. I told him to explain where the money went, who received it, and why he thought I would never find out. He stumbled over his words, his hands trembling. He tried to argue but could not find a single reason to convince me. He stood there, his eyes tearing up, exactly like a child caught red-handed. I suddenly felt a mix of pain and relief. After 3 years of living in an illusion, he finally realized that true power does not lie in money or words, but in determination, knowledge, and the courage to face the truth. I ordered the HR and legal departments to verify all expenses, transactions, and contracts he had signed, emphasizing that the results must be made public to the board of shareholders. Hunter stood nearby, hesitating, not knowing what to say or how to fight back. He remained silent, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He used to think he was the one in control, but now he was just a man standing in front of his wife, stripped of every shred of authority. I knew this was the moment he had to take responsibility for everything he had caused. I received texts from people involved in the suspicious transactions, asking to meet and provide evidence. I read every message, every email, every testimony, and I knew the past could not be denied. Every action Hunter took left a trail, and I would use that very evidence to clean house. I felt a sense of relief knowing justice would be served and the truth could not stay hidden forever. Hunter tried to step closer, whispering a plea for one more chance, promising he would fix it. I looked at him coldly and said no. I told him he had lived in an illusion for 3 years and now it was time to face the consequences. He bowed his head helplessly. For the first time in 3 years, I saw Hunter truly terrified. Not because of me or the company, but because of himself. Because his terrible choices had backed him into a corner with no way out. All morning, I reviewed documents, spoke with my assistant, called the bank, and systematically cleaned up the mess Hunter left behind. Every move I made was precise, never rushed, never heated, but enough to make everyone around feel the strength, confidence, and authority I held. Hunter stood by quietly, not daring to argue. I knew that today, He learned a harsh lesson about truth and accountability. As the workday neared its end, I stood by the window, looking down at the bustling streets of Los Angeles, feeling the sunlight hit the tall glass buildings. I reminded myself that true power is not meant to threaten others, but to protect oneself and what truly matters. Hunter stood behind me, taking slow steps, afraid to come closer. I knew from this moment on every move he made would follow my rules, with no path back to his old tricks. I turned back to my desk, looked at him one more time, and said softly but clearly that everything must be resolved in 3 days, or I would proceed with further legal action. Hunter nodded, eyes still watering, not daring to speak. I knew he had completely fallen into my hands, with no choice left but to obey. The office was quiet, filled only with the sound of flipping pages, ringing phones, and the heartbeats of those watching. I smiled inwardly, knowing things were moving in the right direction and the truth would finally see the light. I still remember clearly that noon, after Hunter bowed his head and left my office looking gray and drained of all life, the massive 36th floor suddenly became strangely quiet. It was not quiet because it was empty, but because everyone was trying to breathe a little lighter and step a little softer. Everyone knew the real storm had only just begun. There are things that seem small in the dark, but once dragged into the light, they grow so fast you cannot even react. I sat at my desk looking at the skyscrapers outside the glass window. I was no longer thinking about Hunter's betrayal. It was strange. A month ago, my heart would have hurt so much I wouldn't have been able to sleep. But that day, I wasn't thinking about love or marriage. I was thinking about my responsibility to the over 3,000 employees working at Apex Holdings. This company was not built by Hunter alone. 3 years ago, when we got married, I brought in over $15 million in investment capital, leveraging my family's entire network of partners, paving the way for dozens of massive projects. While Hunter slept on a plush bed in our multi-million-dollar Beverly Hills mansion, I was constantly waiting at airports for 2 a.m. flights just to secure a contract. Yet in the end, I chuckled to myself. Men are strange. When they have nothing, they are terrified of losing the woman beside them. Once they have everything, they think they created it all themselves. Just then, my desk phone rang. My assistant spoke softly, saying the finance department just sent the files over and asking if she should bring them in. A few minutes later, a thick stack of folders was placed on my desk. I opened each one. At first, it was just unusual expenses of a few tens of thousands of dollars. Then 100,000, 300,000, a million. The more I read, the colder my eyes grew. There was an expense of over $1.5 million labeled as an investment for a resort project in Miami. But according to the progress report, the project only existed on paper. Another expense of $350,000 was logged as client entertainment. What kind of entertainment costs that much? You could feed the entire city and not reach that number. As I was reviewing the files, the door was pushed open forcefully. Hunter walked in. This time, he did not knock, nor did he carry the arrogant aura of a CEO. His suit jacket was wrinkled, his tie was crooked, and his eyes were red. He probably had not slept since morning. He stood across my desk, staring at me for a long time. I did not look up. I asked him what he wanted. He asked if I really had to push things this far. I turned a page and asked him how far he meant. He said I knew perfectly well that if this went public, he would lose everything. I stopped what I was doing, looked up at him, and repeated his words. Lose everything. I put the folder down and asked if he was seriously bringing this up to me. I asked if he thought about losing everything when he used company money to buy Mia a house. I asked if he thought about losing everything when he wired money to outsiders. I asked if he thought about losing everything when he held her right in the middle of the office and let her call herself his wife. Hunter's face turned completely white. He opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. Because some things simply cannot be explained. You can justify a mistake, but you cannot justify betrayal. He sat down in the chair opposite me, clenching his hands tightly. After a while, he whispered that he truly knew he was wrong, that he and Mia were just a temporary fling, and that he never thought about divorcing me. I looked at him and laughed out loud. It was the first time that day I genuinely laughed, but that smile scared him even more. I asked him if he knew what the saddest part was. He looked at me. The saddest part wasn't that he had someone else, but that even now, he still thought I was in pain over his affair. I slowly stood up and walked over to the glass window. I said I was in pain because the man I once loved turned out to be someone like this. Someone who steals money from his own employees to feed his greed. Someone who could betray the very person who stood by his side and built him up from nothing. Someone who, even after getting caught, still looked for ways to lie. The room behind me was silent for a long time. Then I heard a chair scrape aggressively. Immediately after, a heavy thud. I turned around. Hunter was on his knees. This time, it wasn't like the boardroom. There was no audience, no employees, no board of directors. Just the two of us. He kneeled before me, his eyes red. He begged me to give him one more chance, just one, promising he would fix everything, fire Mia, and return all the money. I looked at the man in front of me and suddenly remembered our wedding day. That day, Hunter stood before my father, his hands shaking, promising he would take care of me for the rest of his life. My father only said one thing. He wasn't afraid of him being poor. He was only afraid of him changing his heart. At the time, I was mad at my dad, thinking he was too harsh. But now I understood. Someone with life experience rarely misjudges a person. I looked down at Hunter and told him to get up, stating I did not like seeing people kneel. Hunter looked up as if he saw a glimmer of hope. I took a step back and told him not to misunderstand. I told him to get up not because I forgave him, but because I did not want to waste time looking at a man who was no longer worthy. Suddenly, there was frantic knocking at the door. My assistant rushed in, her face pale. She told me there was a problem. I asked what it was. She swallowed hard and said someone was making a scene in the lobby. It was Hunter's mother. I paused. Hunter's face instantly went white. We both knew perfectly well that if his mother showed up, things were about to get incredibly complicated. I watched Hunter stand frozen in the middle of the office. His face, which had just been paper white, turned a sickly gray. It was the exact expression of a man watching his worst nightmare unfold right before his eyes with nowhere to run. I stood still for a few seconds. My mind flashed back to so many old memories. Because if there was one person in the world who always believed Hunter was the best, the most brilliant, and incapable of doing wrong, it was his mother. On the day I married Hunter, she held my hand and announced in front of all our relatives that her son had suffered so much growing up. So if he ever made a mistake, I should just yield to him, because men face so much pressure out in the world. Back then, I just smiled. I thought all older women loved their sons like that. But later I realized there is a kind of love that waters a plant, and another kind that pours gasoline on a fire. My assistant's voice broke through. She said Martha was arguing with the security guards downstairs, threatening to tear the place apart if anyone tried to stop her. I took a deep breath. Hunter immediately stepped forward, telling me not to go down, and that he would handle it. I turned to look at him and asked if he really thought he could handle anything at this point. Hunter was speechless. I grabbed my phone and walked out. The elevator ride from the 36th floor to the lobby took nearly a minute. But during that time, the silence was so heavy I could hear Hunter's ragged breathing behind me. He kept looking down at his phone, probably trying to call his mother, but she wasn't picking up. When the doors opened, the massive lobby was packed. Employees stood in small clusters. Security guards were blocking the front, and in the center was a woman in her late 50s, pointing her finger and screaming. The moment Martha saw me, she glared. She demanded to know how I dared to show my face down here. The entire lobby went dead silent. I stood about 10 feet away from her and said nothing. She lunged forward, but security held her back. They told her to calm down. She screamed back, asking how she could be calm when her son married a malicious woman like me. She yelled that I was trying to steal her son's company, force him into a divorce, and destroy their family. Whispers started echoing through the crowd. Some people looked down, others snuck glances at me. I just stood there. Sometimes explaining yourself is the most pointless thing you can do. Seeing my lack of reaction only made her angrier. She pointed right at my face and yelled that from the day I married into the family, she knew I was no good. She accused me of always working, going to meetings, traveling on business, and never fulfilling my duties as a wife. She said it was my fault Hunter found someone else, that if a woman couldn't keep her husband, she had no one to blame but herself. Behind me, Hunter looked horrified. He begged his mother to stop talking. She whipped around and asked if she was wrong. She claimed she knew exactly what kind of man her son was, and that if he hadn't been pressured, he wouldn't be in this situation today. I looked at her. My mind wandered back to our first year of marriage. Hunter had a high fever and had to be hospitalized. I canceled a major business trip to Chicago and stayed awake for 3 nights straight taking care of him. At the time, his mother held my hand crying, telling me the family was blessed to have a daughter-in-law like me. Human beings are truly strange. When they need you, you are a saint. When you no longer do as they please, you become the villain. I took one step forward. My voice was very calm. I asked if she was done. Martha froze. She probably expected me to argue back, but I didn't. I looked at her and spoke slowly. I said she accused me of failing my wifely duties. I told her that over the last 3 years, the medical bills for Hunter's father, the mortgage payments for her house in the suburbs, the monthly living expenses I sent, and her grandson's tuition added up to over $200,000. I asked her exactly who paid for all of that. Martha stiffened. I continued. I said she accused me of destroying the family. I asked her who brought in the money to save this company from bankruptcy 3 years ago. Who brought in the clients? Who stayed up until 3 in the morning to sign contracts? Who? My voice was not loud, but the entire lobby was dead silent. Martha opened her mouth but could not find the words, because everything I said was the truth. I turned to Hunter. I told him to speak up and tell everyone if I was lying. Hunter bowed his head, his hands clenched tightly. After a very long time, he whispered that I was right, and that the company only existed today because of me. His mother's eyes widened in shock. She asked him what he was saying, demanding to know if I had brainwashed him, reminding him she was his mother. Hunter closed his eyes. I saw his shoulders shaking. It was probably the first time in his life he had to choose between the truth and siding with his mother. After a moment, he opened his eyes and told his mother he was wrong. He admitted he was the one who wronged me, and none of this was my fault. The lobby felt like a graveyard. Martha looked at her son, her expression shifting from rage to complete bewilderment. A few seconds later, she suddenly took a step back. She asked if he really betrayed his wife. Hunter kept his head down, but his silence was the clearest answer. I watched as his mother's face went from pale to flushed, and then pale again. She stood frozen for nearly half a minute before suddenly lunging forward. A sharp slap echoed through the lobby. Everyone flinched. Hunter stood perfectly still, his head turned to the side, a red handprint forming on his cheek. His mother was trembling. She said she thought the world was wrong, that I was wrong. She said she never imagined it was him. After saying that, she collapsed onto the floor and started crying. The sound of an older woman sobbing in the middle of a massive corporate lobby was both bitter and pathetic. I stood there, my heart suddenly feeling incredibly heavy. Because sometimes, the people who make mistakes aren't the ones who hurt the most. Right then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I opened it. It was a brief message. If you want to know where Hunter is hiding the rest of his money, come to the Daily Grind coffee shop alone tonight at 8. I stared at the screen. Below the text was a photo that made my blood run cold. It was Hunter. And sitting next to him was a little boy, about 5 years old. There are things in life that, if you only hear about them from others, you'd think they only happen in movies. An ordinary person finds it hard to believe that someone could betray them so many times, yet still come home, eat dinner, sleep next to their wife, and wake up the next morning saying loving things as if nothing happened. But the moment I saw that photo on my phone, I realized the boundaries of human greed and deception stretch far beyond my imagination. I stood in the middle of the lobby, phone in hand, screen still unlocked. The photo was still there. Hunter was crouching in front of a 5-year-old boy, holding an ice cream cone. His face carried a very natural, genuine smile. The kind of open smile I hadn't seen from him in nearly a year, because every time he was with me, he claimed he was busy, stressed, and exhausted. I stared at it for a long time. Not because I was hurt, but because my brain was trying to piece together all the scattered fragments. After a while, I slipped the phone into my pocket. Martha was still on the floor crying. Hunter stood next to her, looking like a man who had lost his soul. I didn't say another word. I turned around and walked straight out the door. I heard Hunter call my name from behind, but I didn't look back. Sometimes, when you don't know the full story, you want to demand answers. But when your intuition has already painted the picture, you become terrified of hearing the truth. For the entire ride to the law firm, I hardly spoke. The car drove through the crowded streets of Los Angeles. The early afternoon sun reflected off the glass buildings, blindingly bright. I sat in the back seat looking out the window, my mind completely blank. I remembered a period from over a year ago. That was when Hunter started changing. He came home late constantly and always kept his phone face down. Some nights, he would get a call and step out onto the balcony for a very long time. Back then, I asked if work was just too busy. He hugged me, laughed, and said he was just trying to make as much money as possible so that when we had kids, we wouldn't have to worry about a thing. I believed him. I believed him completely because I never thought the man sleeping next to me could lie with such calm, steady eyes. The car pulled up to the law firm. As I walked in, I saw Kyle waiting for me. Kyle was a college friend and the private corporate attorney for Apex Holdings. He was meticulous, a man of few words, but incredibly reliable. From the moment I started investigating Hunter, he handled almost every single file. The moment I walked in, Kyle instantly recognized my expression. He pulled out a chair and asked what was wrong. I didn't answer right away. I just handed him my phone. Kyle stared at the photo for a few seconds and frowned. He asked where I got it. I told him it was an anonymous text. He stayed quiet. He opened his laptop and told me to send the photo to him. I did. A few minutes later, Kyle blew up the image on his screen. His eyes suddenly locked onto something. He told me to wait and look at the screen. I leaned in. Kyle pointed to the bottom corner of the photo. I hadn't noticed it at first, but zoomed in, it was unmistakable. Around the little boy's neck was a small chain with a coin pendant. I instantly froze. I remembered that necklace perfectly. Last year, for Hunter's birthday, I bought matching white gold coin pendants engraved with our names. One for him, one for me. Hunter told me he loved it, but only wore it a few times before claiming he lost it. I had been upset about it for days. Now, staring at the screen, my heart started pounding. Kyle looked at me and asked if I was okay. I took a deep breath. I said I was fine and that I was going to meet the sender tonight. Kyle immediately objected. He said no, it could be a trap, and it was too dangerous to go alone. I shook my head. I told him they reached out to me with a purpose, and people with a purpose don't necessarily want to hurt you. Kyle stared at me for a long time before sighing. He agreed, but said he was coming with me. I smiled faintly. I told him I already knew he was going to say that. At exactly 8 o'clock, the Daily Grind, located on a quiet side street, wasn't very crowded. Soft piano music played under warm, dim lights. I scanned the room and my eyes stopped at the furthest corner. A woman was sitting with her back to me. She had long hair, wore a white blouse, and looked to be in her early 30s. When she saw me, she stood up slowly and asked if I was Natalie. I sat down across from her. I said I was, and asked who she was. The woman stayed quiet for a few seconds before smiling softly, a terribly sad smile. She said her name was Tara, and that she had been with Hunter for 3 years. My hands tightened. She looked me dead in the eye, her voice barely a whisper. She told me the boy in the photo was her son. In that exact moment, I heard a spoon drop onto the tile floor at the next table over, but I could no longer hear my own heartbeat. I knew everything was about to take a completely different turn. After leaving the Daily Grind, my mind felt so exhausted I could barely breathe. But I didn't stop. I walked straight back to the law firm where everything concerning Hunter, the money, and the secrets he thought were safe were thoroughly prepared by Kyle. When I walked into the conference room, Kyle had files spread all over the table. His eyes were serious, his face intensely focused, as if trying to transfer all his strength and composure to me. I knew there was no way Hunter could deny or dodge this anymore. Every number, every document was clear and transparent, and I was going to use them to force him to face the consequences. Kyle pushed his glasses up and looked at me, speaking in a steady but razor-sharp tone. He told me every expense, every wire transfer Hunter made over the last 3 years had been compiled. He said he would walk me through every line and figure so I could see the full scale and severity of the problem. I nodded and sat down, staring intently at the pages in front of me, feeling both tense and utterly determined. This was the moment I would take methodical steps to clean up the chaos Hunter created. I knew that if I wavered, I would lose the power I had worked so hard to build. Kyle turned on the projector, displaying a web of names, amounts, and the flow of bank accounts. I clearly saw that a total of $10 million had been siphoned out of the company over 3 years. Over $3 million went to offshore accounts in his name, $2 million was divided among his mistresses, and the rest funneled into murky projects. It filled me with anger, but also highlighted the immense power of the truth. Everything was now in my grasp. Every action had evidence, and Hunter had no escape. I looked at Kyle and signaled him to continue. First, the investments in the Miami resort project totaling $1.5 million only existed on paper. Second, the client entertainment expenses of $350,000 had no receipts. Third, the payroll for special employees, which was actually hush money for his mistresses, totaled over $2 million. I took a deep breath, looked at Kyle, and spoke in a calm but icy voice. I told him to prepare all these documents so I could present them directly to Hunter and the board. I wanted everything public and transparent, leaving him nowhere to hide. Kyle nodded, confirming everything from bank statements and contracts to emails and wire transfer receipts had been thoroughly vetted. I flipped through the pages. It felt like the bricks of the wall of lies Hunter built over 3 years were being dismantled piece by piece, leaving behind a void that only the truth could fill. Once done, I looked Kyle in the eye and asked if he was absolutely sure nothing was missing. He confirmed everything was verified without a single flaw. I stood up and walked toward the door. My steps felt heavy, but resolute. I knew my next meeting with Hunter would determine everything, and I would not let him use another lie to squirm his way out. I left the law firm and drove straight to the Beverly Hills mansion Hunter still called our shared home. But to me, it was now just a place to confront the truth, no longer a sanctuary. The door opened. Hunter stood there, his face pale, his dress shirt wrinkled, his tie undone. He looked at me like a man bracing for an unavoidable hurricane. I walked straight into the living room, leaving him standing there without a word. Some things don't need to be said. Actions, expressions, and meticulous preparation are enough. I opened my bag, took out the folders, placed them on the table, and spoke in a calm, lethal tone. I told him I knew about every dollar, every action, and every person he thought he had kept hidden. I told him I had all the proof. I said he was going to stand there and face it all. I didn't need him to say a word, because everything was going to be presented to the company and the shareholders. Hunter choked up. His trembling hands rested on the table, his eyes locked on the files. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He knew everything he tried to bury was now painfully visible. I looked at him, emphasizing every word. I told him he would take responsibility for everything he had done, and I would not forgive a single attempt to hide the truth. I said everyone would know and everything would be made public. Hunter sat down, buried his face in his hands, and let out a long sigh. For the first time, I saw true remorse and terror in him. The power and money he once wielded were now meaningless. As for me, standing in the position of absolute authority, I felt a mix of relief and intense pressure. I knew from now on, not just Hunter, but everyone around me would look at me differently, with a mix of respect and fear. They would realize that a woman armed with the truth and hard evidence will not back down for anyone, not even her husband. I stood there looking at him, my voice deep and firm. I told him we were going to sit down tonight. He was going to explain every expense and every action, and we were going to decide how to handle this. I told him if he cooperated, things would go smoothly. If not, the law and the truth would decide his fate. Hunter looked up, his eyes bloodshot. He bowed his head and whispered my name, promising he would do whatever I said, just begging for a chance. I nodded without another word. My silence was the ultimate proof of my power and composure. Hunter was going to have to face his own actions and the consequences of years of lies. I knew this was only the first step in cleaning up his mess. We both sat in silence. The only sound was the steady ticking of the clock, a slow rhythm that I felt marking the power of truth and resolve. I knew tonight was the defining moment when every lie would be dragged into the light. Hunter would realize that I was the one in control now, and he had no choice but to follow the path I set. That night, after saying those words, I didn't stay in the living room. I slowly walked upstairs. There are things that, once you've seen the absolute bottom of, you no longer want to argue or scream like a dramatic teenager. The feeling was strange, like a glass that had shattered on the floor. People looking in only see the broken shards, but only the glass knows it had been cracked long before it fell. I stood in front of the master bedroom, my hand on the doorknob, but I didn't open it right away. This room used to be the place I thought I'd live in for the rest of my life. It was the place where, returning from business trips, I knew someone was waiting for me. It was the place where Hunter would hold me and say we'd have 2 kids, a boy and a girl, and retire to a cabin in Aspen when we grew old. Now, looking back, those words felt like writing in the sand. One gust of wind, and it was all gone. I pushed the door open. The room was exactly the same. Our wedding portrait still hung on the wall, the 2 of us smiling brightly. I walked over to the portrait, stared at it for a long time, and reached up to take it down. Not aggressively, not in anger, just gently taking down something that no longer belonged to me. Footsteps sounded behind me. Hunter stood in the doorway. He looked at the frame in my hands, his face instantly turning pale. He asked what I was doing. I didn't look back. I told him I was packing up things we no longer needed. Hunter walked in, his voice trembling. He begged me not to do this. He said we needed to talk and that he knew he was wrong. I put the frame on the table and turned to look at him. I asked him if he knew what the strangest thing was. He looked at me. I told him that when a woman is still in love, she asks a lot of questions. Where are you going? What are you doing? Why are you late? Why aren't you answering? Why are you acting cold? But when she stops asking, that is when she truly wants to leave. Hunter stood frozen, the color draining from his face. I opened the closet. Our clothes were hanging together. I saw a light blue dress shirt of his. It was the shirt I bought him for his birthday last year. At the time, he said he loved it and wore it the very next day. But looking at it now, I suddenly remembered something. Last November, Hunter went on a 3-day business trip to Las Vegas. The day he came back, he was wearing that exact shirt. I was putting his clothes away when I caught the scent of women's perfume on the collar. I had asked him if he changed his laundry detergent. Hunter laughed, rubbed my head, and said he probably just sat next to a female client and the smell rubbed off. Back then, I believed him. I looked down and smiled faintly. When you're in love, you lie to yourself much more than anyone else lies to you. Seeing me smile like that made Hunter panic even more. He stepped forward and grabbed my hand, begging me not to smile like that because it terrified him. I looked at his hand and slowly pulled mine away. I asked him if he was terrified when he lied to me. I asked if he was terrified when he handed company money to other women. I asked if he was terrified when he called me his ex in front of his mistress. Hunter looked down and said nothing. The room was so quiet that only the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was Kyle. I picked up. He asked what was going on. His voice was unusually deep. He told me he just had someone run a background check on Tara, and there was a problem. I frowned, asking what he meant. He said the child definitely exists, but Tara lied to me about one thing. I stood up straight and asked what it was. Kyle paused for a few seconds. He said the child is not Hunter's biological son. I was stunned. I asked him to repeat it. Kyle said medical records from 2 years ago showed Hunter took a private fertility test. The results proved he was naturally infertile. I gripped my phone, my whole body going rigid. Kyle continued, saying he assumed Hunter never told me this, and that the situation was much more complicated than I thought. I stood perfectly still. If the child wasn't Hunter's, why had he been taking care of him for years? Why send the money? Why hide it? But the thing that sent chills down my spine wasn't even that. It was a memory that suddenly clicked. 2 years ago, Hunter sat me down very seriously and suggested we get health checkups. He said he thought I was working too hard and that's why we couldn't get pregnant. I actually went to the doctor. I blamed myself for so long. I took fertility supplements for half a year. I cried alone in the hospital bathroom thinking I couldn't be a mother. And Hunter? He sat next to me, hugged me, and told me it was okay, that he didn't need kids, he only needed me. My hands started shaking. I slowly turned my head to look at Hunter standing in front of me. He saw the look on my face and took a step back. I stared right at him, my voice very quiet, but so cold it felt foreign even to me. I asked him if, 2 years ago, he was the one who was infertile. In that exact moment, Hunter's face turned dead white. There are times when a person doesn't immediately explode in anger upon hearing the truth, nor do they burst into tears like in the movies. Because when the pain exceeds your limit of endurance, the first emotion isn't agony, it's emptiness. It feels like being thrown into a frozen lake in the dead of winter. You get so cold you lose all sensation, so cold you don't even know how to react anymore. I stood in the middle of the bedroom that was once my sanctuary, looking at Hunter standing a few feet away. I watched his face go from white to sickly pale, and from pale to absolute panic. Meanwhile, my brain kept repeating one single question. If he was the one with the problem, why was I the one forced to live in guilt for 2 years? Hunter stared at me, his throat bobbing as he swallowed, but no sound came out. His hands were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. I recognized that look. After 3 years of marriage, I knew it too well. Every time he hid something from me, he got that exact look, like a man desperately searching for an exit in a room with no doors. I took a slow step forward. Not fast, not rushed, but every step felt like I was trampling on all the years I spent trusting this man. I told him to speak. I asked if the test results from 2 years ago were his. Hunter looked down. He didn't answer. I let out a laugh. It was a very soft laugh, but the softer it was, the more terrified he looked. I asked him if he planned on keeping up the lie, or if he wanted me to pull up the medical records. Hearing that, Hunter looked like someone had drained the life out of him. He stumbled back 2 steps and collapsed onto the edge of the bed. He buried his face in his hands, his hair a mess. He looked nothing like the confident CEO who used to address hundreds of employees. A long time passed before he finally spoke. He said yes. I stood still. He admitted that 2 years ago, he was the one who was infertile. The room went dead silent. So quiet I could hear the faint hum of the central AC. I stared at him without blinking. Hunter kept his face buried in his hands. He confessed that on the day he got the results, he sat in his car for nearly 3 hours. He didn't dare come home. He said he was terrified I would find out. He was afraid I would be disappointed. He was afraid I would look at him with pity. I remained silent. My mind was flooding with memories. I remembered the days I quietly drank bitter herbal supplements, the hospital visits, the times I cried my eyes out in the restroom only to wash my face, walk out, and force a smile, telling Hunter everything was fine. The most pathetic part was that back then, I actually felt guilty. I even told him that if he really wanted a child someday, I wouldn't stop him from finding someone else. Hunter had hugged me tight and cried in front of me. Now I realized he wasn't crying because he felt bad for me. He was crying out of guilt for his own lie. I looked at him and laid it out. So he pinned all the blame on me. He let me believe I couldn't be a mother. He watched me suffer for 2 years without saying a single word. My voice wasn't loud, but Hunter sank lower and lower. Finally, his shoulders began to shake. He apologized repeatedly, saying he didn't mean to. He just didn't want to lose me. I looked at him and suddenly burst out laughing. This time I really laughed, but the harder I laughed, the redder my eyes got. He didn't want to lose me. I told him he didn't want to lose me, so he went out and found someone else. He didn't want to lose me, so he called me his ex. He didn't want to lose me, so he used company money to fund his affairs. He didn't want to lose me, so he let me live feeling like a failure of a woman for 2 years. Hunter couldn't answer. He sat there with his head down like a child who had done something wrong. But some mistakes can't be fixed just by lowering your head. Right at that moment, Hunter's phone rang. He jumped, looked at the screen, and his face changed completely. I saw the name Mia flash on the screen. He scrambled to decline the call, but less than 3 seconds later, the phone rang again. And a third time. A fourth. A fifth. I looked at him and told him to answer it. When he hesitated, his face ashen, he stammered that it wasn't what I thought. I pulled up a chair and sat down. I gave him 3 seconds. Either he answered it, or I would. Hunter stood paralyzed. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. I reached out, grabbed the phone off the table, and hit speakerphone. Mia's voice blared through the speaker. She frantically asked where he was, screaming that there was an emergency. She said she was pregnant. In that fraction of a second, I watched every drop of blood drain from Hunter's face. I just sat there. If this had happened in the past, the pain would have killed me. But now, I just found it hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. The man who had just finished crying about being infertile was receiving the news that his mistress was pregnant. But the thing that chilled me to the bone wasn't the pregnancy. It was the sheer panic in Hunter's eyes. Because he knew better than anyone else that the baby absolutely could not be his. They say that when one secret is exposed, the rest bubble up to the surface like rotting wood rising after a heavy storm. Sitting on the chair by the window in my own bedroom, looking at the glowing phone screen, looking at Hunter's ghostly pale face, I didn't feel pain anymore. It was an indescribable feeling, like walking through a long, muddy road, falling over and over again. And when you finally make it out and look back, you realize the exhaustion didn't come from the road. It came from the person walking next to you. On the phone, Mia kept talking. She asked why he wasn't saying anything. She said she was scared, that she just got back from the doctor, and she was 6 weeks along. The silence in the room was so heavy I could hear Hunter's rapid breathing. I slowly placed the phone on the table and looked at him. I asked if he was too overjoyed to speak. Hunter violently shook his head. He stammered, telling me it wasn't true and begging to explain. He stopped halfway because he knew there was no explanation left. A few hours ago, he could still drop to his knees. He could cry and say he was tempted, that it was a temporary lapse in judgment. But now, an infertile man with a pregnant mistress? I didn't even need to point out the math. The reality spoke for itself. I leaned back in my chair, my voice practically a whisper. I told him to tell me whose baby it was. Hunter flinched. He said he didn't know. I laughed. I told him he knew he was infertile. So what didn't he know? Didn't he know who the woman sleeping next to him was actually sleeping with? Hunter stared at the floor, his hands gripping his knees so hard his veins popped. Suddenly, he shot up. He said he was going to find her and get to the bottom of this. He snatched his car keys and marched out the door. I didn't stop him. I didn't call him back, because some people always think they are running toward the truth when in reality, they are just running away from it. The door slammed shut, and the room fell silent again. I sat there for a few minutes before my phone buzzed again. It was Kyle. I answered. He paused for a second before his voice went grim. He told me he just received another file. There was one more thing about Hunter. I furrowed my brow. Honestly, at that point, I didn't think anything could surprise me anymore. I asked him what it was. Kyle sighed. He said 2 years ago, when I was on a month-long business trip to London, Hunter wired over $150,000 to a private medical clinic. I froze. A clinic? Kyle said yes. Initially, he thought it was regular medical bills, but his investigators just confirmed the money was for a fertility clinic. I sat up straight, asking what he meant. Kyle was silent for a few seconds. He said Hunter paid for an IVF surrogate procedure. My brain flatlined. Outside the window, the city lights were bright, cars were moving, everything was normal, but my mind completely shut down. It was impossible. Why would he do that? Kyle spoke slowly. He said he wasn't 100% sure yet, but the female patient listed on the file wasn't me. I slumped into the chair, my hands freezing. After a long time, I asked who it was. The line went quiet before Kyle said the name. Tara. I jerked my head up. My brain felt like it was exploding. Tara again. The woman who just sat in the cafe telling me the child wasn't Hunter's. The woman who conveniently reached out to me. Everything suddenly connected. But something was wrong. I remembered the look in Tara's eyes at the cafe. It was sad, but it wasn't the look of a lover. When she talked about Hunter, there was no hatred, no love, just exhaustion. I gripped my phone and told Kyle to keep digging. I wanted the whole truth. He agreed immediately. I had barely hung up when the bedroom door violently swung open. Hunter was back, but he looked even worse than when he left. His shirt was completely untucked, he was sweating profusely, and his eyes were bloodshot. He stood in the doorway, shaking, and delivered a sentence that stopped my heart. He said Tara was missing. I sprang up. I asked what he meant. He was panting. He said he found out she was admitted to the hospital 3 days ago, but then she vanished. Her phone was off. He searched everywhere. I stared at him, a cold chill running down my spine. Because right at that exact moment, my phone buzzed. Another unknown number. One short text. If you want the truth about Tara, come to Cedar Ridge Hospital right now. If you're late, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. They say life is like walking through dense fog. When you're in it, you can't see anything but an opaque wall of white. But once you walk through it and look back, you realize every single event left a trail. You just didn't want to believe it at the time. That night, reading that text, my heart sank. Not out of fear, but because my intuition told me the truth waiting for me was much bigger than anything I already knew. I looked at the screen for a few seconds, then looked at Hunter. I told him we were going to Cedar Ridge Hospital. He frowned and asked why. I handed him my phone. He read the text, his face shifting instantly. He asked who sent it. I said I didn't know, but assumed he wanted to find out too. He gripped the phone, pressed his lips together, and nodded. During the drive to the hospital, neither of us spoke. Outside the window, the yellow streetlights of late-night Los Angeles blurred past. Traffic had thinned out. The inside of the car was so quiet I could hear Hunter's uneven breathing from the driver's seat. Every now and then, he'd glance at me, then look away, like he wanted to say something but didn't have the courage. 20 minutes later, we pulled up to Cedar Ridge Hospital. It was a massive private medical center. I had been here a few times for corporate charity events sponsoring healthcare for underprivileged kids, but I never imagined I'd return to uncover the truth about my own marriage. As soon as we stepped into the lobby, my phone buzzed. The same unknown number. One line. Room 308. I checked the directory. 3rd floor. Stepping into the elevator, my heart started pounding. It was a strange feeling, like knowing the door you're about to open will permanently alter everything you believe to be true. The elevator chimed. The hospital corridor was dead quiet, smelling faintly of antiseptic. I walked slowly to room 308. The door was slightly ajar, the lights on inside. I pushed it open. In that split second, I froze entirely. Lying on the hospital bed was Tara. She looked incredibly pale, an IV drip in her arm. Sitting next to her, asleep with his head on the mattress, was the 5-year-old boy, Tommy, the boy from the photo. Tara saw me and smiled faintly, a very tired smile. She said I made it. I stood still for a few seconds before stepping inside. Behind me, Hunter froze too. He asked her why she was here. Tara looked at him, her eyes completely calm. She asked if he came too. Hunter rushed forward, demanding to know what happened to her, why she disappeared, and why she wasn't answering her phone. Tara looked at him for a long time before asking softly if he was actually worried about her. Hunter stalled, unable to answer. I pulled up a chair and looked straight at Tara. I told her she was the one who texted me. Tara nodded. She said she wanted to tell me everything. The room fell completely silent. Outside, I could hear a medical cart rolling down the hall and the soft footsteps of a nurse. But inside, the silence was suffocating. Tara looked at Tommy sleeping beside her and gently stroked his hair. She said Tommy was her son, but not Hunter's. I didn't speak. Hunter didn't speak. Tara looked down and began her story. She said 3 years ago, she met Hunter at this very hospital. Her mother was terminally ill. She had no money for the treatments. He was the one who helped her. He visited often, bought medication, paid the hospital bills, and took care of her mother. Hunter stood paralyzed. Tara gave a bitter smile. She said she actually thought he liked her, but later realized he was just grooming her for a favor. I clenched my fists. A favor? Tara looked up at me, her eyes red. She said 2 years ago he told her he wanted a child but didn't want his wife to know he had a medical condition. He told her that if she acted as a surrogate and had a baby for him, he would give her enough money to take care of her mother for the rest of her life. The room was dead silent. I turned to look at Hunter. He looked like he had just been hit by a freight train. He begged Tara to stop talking. Tara laughed, but tears rolled down her face. She asked why she shouldn't. Was he scared? Was he scared his wife would find out he planned on lying to her for the rest of their lives? I looked at Hunter. For the first time that night, I saw genuine, unadulterated despair in his eyes. But the thing that truly made my blood run cold was Tara's next sentence. She looked at me, her voice barely a whisper. She apologized, saying what she told me at the cafe wasn't the whole truth. Because the person who actually proposed the surrogacy wasn't Hunter. Tara slowly turned her head toward the door. At that exact moment, an older woman's voice rang out from behind me. It was me. I whipped around. Standing in the doorway was Hunter's mother. There are truths that terrify you before they are revealed, but once they are out in the open, the fear vanishes. Because by then, the emotional overload has crossed a threshold. Like standing in a downpour for so long that once you're completely drenched, you can't tell which raindrop is colder than the rest. Seeing Martha standing there, her hands gripping an old purse, her hair disheveled, her face as pale as someone who hadn't slept in days, I felt a very strange sensation. For the first time since marrying into that family, I didn't see the overbearing woman who constantly criticized me. I just saw an exhausted, aging mother who could barely stand. The room was dead silent. Hunter was paralyzed. He barely managed to whisper her name. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on Tara as she slowly walked into the room. Every step looked incredibly heavy. Reaching the bed, she gently touched sleeping Tommy's hair, then bowed her head deeply. She apologized to Tara. Tara's eyes welled with tears. She told her not to do that it was in the past. But Martha shook her head, saying it wasn't in the past, and she would never forgive herself for what she did. I stood silently. I knew my only job right now was to listen, to hear it all. Martha turned to me, her eyes red. She told me I had every right to hate her, but tonight she was going to lay it all out. She pulled up a chair, her trembling hands resting on her knees, staring blankly ahead as if looking at a memory from long ago. She said 2 years ago, when Hunter got his medical results, he hid them from me, but not from her. She said he cried, he kneeled in front of her. He told her he couldn't have kids. He said he was terrified of losing me, that if I knew, I would surely leave him. I remained silent. Martha wiped a tear. She admitted she was wrong, but she had genuinely believed that if they just produced a child, the marriage would be saved. She thought having a grandchild would make me happy. She thought things would magically get better. I smiled, but it was a cold, empty smile. So she found Tara. Martha bowed her head. Yes, she was the one who found her. She was the one who paid her mother's hospital bills. She was the one who promised that after the baby was born, she would give them a lump sum and send them away to live somewhere else. Hunter leaped up. He asked his mother what she was talking about, insisting he knew nothing about this. His mother turned to him, the adoration completely gone from her eyes. She told him to shut up. She said she was wrong because she loved him blindly, but he was far worse. She just wanted a grandchild, but he had a wife and still slept with woman after woman. She said he used his pain as an excuse to do despicable things. Hunter stood stiff, unable to utter a word. Because you can argue with an outsider, but you cannot argue with your own mother. I looked at Tara. She was looking down, clutching her blanket. Suddenly, she sat up. She looked at me and apologized. She said she desperately needed the money at first. She had no other choice. But later, she found out Hunter had a wife, and she wanted to back out. She wanted to take her mother and leave. But then her voice choked up. Her mother died. The room was silent again. I looked at her, no longer feeling any anger, just a tangled mess of emotions. Tara continued. She said after her mother died, she found out she was pregnant. She considered an abortion, but the doctor warned her that her body was too weak. If she went through with it, she might never be able to have children again. She said she was terrified. Tears streamed down her face. So she kept Tommy and raised him on her own. But she never took another dime from Hunter. The only reason he visited was because he assumed the boy was his. She never corrected him because she didn't want Tommy to grow up without a father figure. I turned to look at Tommy. He was sleeping so peacefully, clutching a cheap toy car. He looked so innocent. Yet us adults had piled so many of our horrible mistakes onto the life of a child. Right then, Kyle called. I stepped out into the hallway to answer. His voice was frantic. He said the finance department just flagged an outgoing wire transfer of $2 million. I frowned and asked who authorized it. The line was quiet for a second. Kyle said the login credentials belonged to Hunter. I snapped my head back to look inside the room. Hunter was gone. They say when a person is pushed to the edge, they either sit down and accept their fate, or they do one final, desperate thing to save themselves. Hunter clearly chose the latter. The moment Kyle said $2 million was wired out, and I realized Hunter was missing from the room. A freezing chill ran down my spine. Not because of the money, and not out of shock, but because I knew this man too well. He never truly accepted defeat. A man like Hunter could kneel, cry, and apologize, but the second he saw a crack, he would claw his way out of the pit at any cost. I rushed back into the room. Martha was sitting next to Tommy. Tara saw my face and sat up immediately, asking what was wrong. I scanned the room and asked where Hunter was. His mother jumped, saying he just stepped out to take a phone call. I gripped my phone as Kyle continued. He said security checked the cameras. Hunter went back to his office 30 minutes ago, used his emergency executive access to bypass the financial lock, and wired the money through 3 offshore shell accounts. If we had been a minute slower, it would have been unrecoverable. I closed my eyes for 1 second, then opened them. My voice was so calm it surprised me. I ordered him to freeze it, contact the bank immediately, and notify the legal department. I told him I'd be at the office in 10 minutes. I hung up and looked at Martha. All the color had vanished from her face. She stammered, asking if he really tried to steal from the company. I looked at her and didn't answer, because some questions don't need answers. Sometimes silence hurts more than words. I turned to walk out the door, but a few steps in, I heard a voice call my name. I stopped. Martha slowly stood up. She looked at me, her eyes red. She begged me, pleading that no matter what he did, to please not send him to prison. I stood there for a long time before slowly turning around. I asked her if she remembered 3 years ago when the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. She looked stunned. I gave a sad smile. I told her that if I hadn't brought in that capital, over 3,000 people would have lost their jobs. People with babies, people paying mortgages, people taking care of their elderly parents. If the company went under, Hunter wouldn't be the only one suffering. Thousands of families would suffer. Martha bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. I told her I didn't want to destroy him, but I couldn't use my sympathy to justify being unjust to thousands of others. I turned around and walked away. The hospital corridor was incredibly long. The sound of my heels clicked rhythmically against the floor. Not too fast, not too slow. But inside, my chest felt so heavy I could barely breathe. 2 hours later, I walked into the boardroom on the 36th floor of Apex Holdings. The tension in the room was palpable. Kyle was there, the legal team was there, the finance department was there. Everyone was waiting. The massive screen on the wall displayed constantly refreshing financial data. As soon as I walked in, Kyle stood up. He said they caught it. I let out a breath and asked how much. He said they only managed to divert about $100,000. The rest was frozen in time. I sat down, my entire body suddenly feeling exhausted. Kyle slid a folder toward me. He said there was one more thing. I opened it and froze. It was a share transfer agreement. The assignor was Hunter. The assignee was Mia. I stared at it for a few seconds and laughed. I didn't feel pain anymore. I just found it pathetic. This man truly never disappointed when it came to his own selfishness. Even as he was losing everything, his only thought was securing a backup plan for himself. Kyle looked at me. He said Hunter was intercepted at LAX. He was trying to board a private flight to the Bahamas. The room went silent. I looked out the glass window. The city of Los Angeles was still glowing, traffic was still moving, people were still rushing around. Everything was perfectly normal, except for one person whose entire life was collapsing piece by piece. After a long time, I asked where he was. Kyle said they had him in the security holding room downstairs. I nodded and stood up. I knew some things had to be finished personally, and this time, I wanted to close the final door myself. Some marriages end with a piece of paper, some end with a massive screaming match, but some marriages die long before it's over. The two people just keep standing in the same house, playing out their roles to the bitter end. When I went down to the security room at Apex Holdings that night and saw Hunter sitting there alone, for the first time in years, I wasn't angry. I didn't even blame him anymore, because at that moment, I realized that the most pathetic person in a betrayal isn't always the victim. Sometimes, it's the person who single-handedly threw away the most precious thing they ever had. Hunter was sitting with his head down on a bench. His shirt was a wrinkled mess, his tie was loose, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. Just a few days ago, he was the CEO of a major corporation. Everywhere he went, people bowed to him. Assistants followed him. Luxury cars chauffeured him. Now, he looked like he had aged a decade. Hearing my footsteps, he slowly looked up. When he saw me, his eyes instantly watered. I pulled up a chair and sat across from him. There was only a small table between us, but the distance felt like lifetimes. Neither of us spoke at first. Outside, the city lights were bright, the faint hum of traffic echoing in the distance. After a very long time, Hunter gave a broken smile. He asked me if I knew what he thought about while being detained at the airport. He said he thought about the first day we met. I said nothing. He looked down and smiled. He said back then, he had absolutely nothing. Just a beat-up Honda Civic and a tiny studio apartment. In the winter, the roof leaked onto the bed, and in the summer, the fan would blow all night and they still couldn't sleep. Yet, he said, he was so happy. His hands clenched. He said once he got money, he felt empty. Once he had a company, he wanted a bigger one. Once he got status, he wanted more power. Once he had a good woman by his side, he started thinking there was something better out there. It was only when he lost everything that he realized how incredibly stupid he was. I looked at him, my voice completely flat. I told him there are things in life you can lose and find again, but some things, once lost, are gone forever. He looked up at me, his eyes red. He asked if I really couldn't forgive him. I stayed quiet for a few seconds before standing up slowly. I told him I had already forgiven him many times. He just never knew it. The times he came home late and lied. The time he forgot our anniversary. The times he acted cold toward me. The time I smelled perfume on his shirt. I knew about a lot of things. I chose to stay quiet because I believed everyone makes mistakes. But making a mistake once is an accident. Making the same mistake over and over again is a choice. Hunter bowed his head, tears hitting the floor. He didn't speak again, because some words, in the end, are just meaningless. A month later, Hunter officially resigned from the corporation. Almost all the embezzled funds were recovered. The legal violations were handled accordingly. But in the end, I didn't send him to prison. Not because I was soft, but because his mother kneeled before me one last time. She didn't cry. She just bowed her head and said she owed me too much, but begged me to give him a chance to start over. I agreed. Hunter sold his private condo, his luxury cars, and every asset in his name to pay back the restitution. I heard that a few months later, he left Los Angeles and moved to a small town in Texas, opening a hardware store with an old friend. Nobody knew how his life was going, and nobody ever brought him up again. As for Tara, I helped her move to a new apartment, covered her medical expenses, and found her a stable job. Tommy was a very sweet kid. He loved calling me Aunt Natalie. One time, he was sitting there eating ice cream and asked me, "Aunt Natalie, are you going to have a baby someday?" I looked at him and laughed. I said probably, but it might take a little while. He tilted his head and asked why. I rubbed his head and told him it was because I was learning how to be happy first. A year later, Apex Holdings was thriving more than ever. Everything had stabilized. One late afternoon, near the holidays, I was standing in my office watching the golden sunlight hit the glass buildings when my phone buzzed. It was a text message. The sender was Hunter. It was one short line. "Natalie, thank you for not destroying me. I owe you my life." I looked at the text for a long time, then gently locked the screen. I didn't reply, because some people walk with you for a very long time, but eventually, they are just meant to stop at a certain station. People go through their whole lives thinking the most valuable things are money, status, and the things they haven't acquired yet. But when they lose it all, they finally understand that the most precious thing is the person who stood next to them when they had absolutely nothing. It's just a shame that not everyone realizes that soon enough. There are stories where, when the book closes, people only remember if the characters were rich or poor, who won or lost, how much money was stolen, or who got the real estate. But a few days later, those numbers wash away like rain on a window pane. What lingers the longest in our hearts isn't the things you can count with a calculator. It's the bitter heartache of watching someone who had it all throw away what mattered most. And it's the warmth of knowing that, even amidst the absolute wreckage, people can still choose grace. Thinking back on all this, I realized life is just a long road trip. A lot of people get on your bus. Some ride for a few stops and get off. Some travel with you for a very long time. But not everyone who sits next to you is meant to ride all the way to the end of the line. Time shows you a person's face, but adversity shows you their heart. There are couples who, when they are dead broke, hold hands tightly, sharing a single slice of pizza or a cheap burger, and they laugh like they own the world. But when life gets comfortable, when there's a luxury car in the driveway and millions in the bank, hearts start to wander. Because the hardest thing to hold on to in this world isn't money, it's gratitude. People are strange. When they are broke, they are terrified of starving. When they get rich, they are terrified of being outdone. They get a house, they want a mansion. They get a car, they want a Porsche. They have someone who loves them, and they start looking over the fence. They keep running, climbing, fighting, and one day, they look back and realize the thing they were searching for was dropped miles behind them. Many people think happiness is waiting at the finish line, but happiness rarely stands at the end of the road waiting for you to catch up. It usually sits quietly in the most ordinary moments. In a family dinner where everyone is present. In hearing your mother call you to the table. In a phone call from your dad asking if work was exhausting today. In a simple text on a rainy day saying, "Drive safe." Those things are so small that most people ignore them. But when they are gone, trying to buy them back will cost you the rest of your life. Speaking of parents, I'm reminded of an old saying I heard growing up, though I never really understood it back then. People used to say that parents raising children is like a candle burning at both ends. The brighter it shines for the child, the faster it melts away. When you're young, it's just a saying. But when you grow up, you realize every gray hair on your parents' heads was traded for sleepless nights worrying about you. Some parents work from dawn to dusk for their kids. Some never buy themselves a decent outfit, but never hesitate to pay for their child's college tuition. Some refuse to go to the doctor because they are afraid of the medical bills. And when the children grow up, make money, travel the world, meet new people, and build their own lives, they sometimes forget that back home, two people are slowly aging every single day. Parents age in silence, quietly, like an old oak tree in the front yard losing a few leaves every day, until you finally look closely and realize the trunk has withered. When we were kids and got a fever, the whole house stayed awake. Yet when our parents have aching backs, bad knees, failing eyesight, and fading hearing, so many people just brush it off and say, "It's just old age." It sounds simple, but it's enough to break an aging parent's heart for a very long time. So if your parents are still around today, if you still have someone to call mom or dad, if you still have someone waiting for you to come home for dinner, you are incredibly blessed. Don't wait until the house is empty to remember the people who used to sit there. Don't wait until you desperately want to hear their voice, only to realize the phone will never ring again. At the end of the day, living alongside others isn't about seeing who makes the most money, who lives in the biggest house, or who drives the nicest car. It's about knowing that when you are exhausted, when you hit rock bottom, you can look over your shoulder and see someone still standing right behind you. A decent person might not be rich. A sincere person might not be smooth with words. But decent people go the distance. Because life is an echo. Whatever you throw out into the world, you will eventually get back. Put out coldness, you get loneliness. Put out deceit, you get loss. Put out grace, and you will find peace. You might not see it today. You might not see it tomorrow. But life is long. Karma might walk slowly, but it rarely gets lost. And if, after hearing this story, you are sitting next to your parents, give them a hug. If you are far away, give them a call. If you are angry with someone you love, try softening your voice just a little. Winning an argument isn't always a victory. Keeping the person in your life is what truly matters. Money can be remade. Careers can be rebuilt. But once familial love goes cold for too long, no amount of effort can warm it back up in time. Life is too short. So short that the moment spring passes, you already have a few more gray hairs on your head. So slow down a little, be a little kinder, be a little more forgiving, and go home a little more often. Because in the end, what warms your heart isn't what you have, but who you have left beside you.